Okay, enzymes and chemical reactions. So life is a series of chemical reactions. What you do with the food you eat, what you do with the air you breathe, all of those processes that keep you alive, we know what those chemical reactions are. So we've cut a lot of the mystery out of what it means to be alive. In the past, when people didn't understand biology very well, we had sort of mystic or just off the top of our heads explanations for things. But now we really understand. And guess what's happened? We can now treat the body, we can treat its illnesses, we can diagnose what's going wrong, and we can develop medicines that very specifically target the particular chemical reaction or whatever it happens to be, and look at the lives we've saved and look at how long we've extended the average lifespan of people around the world. We've gone from about 35 years, 100 years ago, to virtually double that in just 100 years here. So we won't really be talking about medicine or anything in this chapter, but we'll just be talking about the chemistry of life a tiny bit here. So let's begin. So everything that organisms do, from growing to reproducing, movement, it's all based on different chemical reactions. A chemical reaction, by definition, is just a process that changes or transforms a set of chemicals into another. So I think in an analogy before, I've talked about take a Lego house. It's made of individual bricks. Put the bricks together in a certain way, and it's a house. You really couldn't interpret it any other way. But we could break down all of those individual building blocks and reassemble them into whatever we want. We could build a car or a bridge, anything at all out of those building blocks. And that's really what our bodies do. And I should say, I was going to say this earlier, but I forgot. There are still parts of what it means to be alive that are mysterious to us, but there aren't very many left. Consciousness, for example. I can close my eyes and picture pretty much whatever I want. But what is that image? Where is that picture? What is the voice in our heads? We don't know that, but there's really no reason right now to assume that it comes from anything other than the chemistry of our brains. Because we know that in a previous lecture, we looked at MRI machines of different organs, and I talked about the brain in certain people, like psychopathic murderers or something, is their brain activity is far, far lower in certain areas. Or actually, it could potentially be much higher in other areas that you have parts of your brain that control your fight or flight response. So these produce like stress hormones that can really aggravate you. So perhaps they have an overstimulation in that area. And that's regulating their mood and their identity and who they are, for example. So anyways, some chemical reactions happen very slowly, like rust forming on a bridge or under your car. But others happen extremely quickly when you dump baking soda and vinegar together. Well, that reaction is instantaneous. In a chemical reaction, what you start with are the reactants. Chemical formulas, we draw them. So we'll have compound X plus compound Y. And this will give us, because it's a chemical reaction, they'll be transformed into something else. So we can say compound A plus compound B. Maybe it'll form three things, compound C. That's totally possible in any chemical reaction. So these are the reactants right here. Reactants. And what comes out of your chemical reaction are called the products. Reactants and products. Here we go. So I have that written here. I have an actual specific example written here. Baking soda and vinegar.
Can I get Jeff Fredrickson or Sue Patterson to call and teach us something?
So anyways, This is the chemical formula for baking soda. So it's got sodium, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen in it. One of each of those elements, except for it has 3 oxygens. Now if we look at vinegar, which is actually acetic acid, vinegar it's 95% water and 5% this acid, acetic acid. So this is actually the chemical formula of acetic acid. It's got hydrogen, 2 carbons. Sorry, 1 hydrogen, 2 carbons, 3 other hydrogens, and 2 oxygens. We separate those because they're bonded in a special way. Anyways, so what's important here is we have to have those same numbers conserved on the other side. So in this entire reaction, if you look here, I only have 1 sodium over there, 1 sodium atom. Okay, now that doesn't mean that I have just 1 single sodium all the time. It means the ratio. There's always 1. Well, that means that there should only be 1 sodium over here. That's the only way it would be balanced. And what do you know? That's exactly what we find here. We'll just look at one other. Let's look at the carbon. I have 1 carbon over here, and I have 2 carbons over here. So there should be a total of 3 of those on this side. Well, I have right there, here's a carbon. Since the 2 comes directly after the carbon, that means there's 2 of them there. None there, and I have 1 carbon all by itself over here. So boom, everything is balanced. Now, we look at this, and what we can see is, just like our Lego house, we have separated all of these letters apart from each other, and then just reassembled them in a different way. So, I can't remember, this is water and this is carbon dioxide. When you mix the baking soda and the vinegar together, they make a new product. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, sorry. But, so we have sodium, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen over here, carbon and oxygen over there. Those are what chemical reactions are. So they always involve changes in the chemical bonds that join atoms in compounds. So the only way to separate those is to break apart. Remember, it's the electrons that mesh and overlap, and that's what holds atoms together. If we actually go back here and look at this, the hydrogen and the oxygen atoms are meshed together, but they're not meshed together with anything else in this reaction. To break those apart requires energy. And usually bonds are always reestablished. So energy is either absorbed or released when a chemical reaction takes place. Some reactions, in order for them to occur, you have to add energy to the system, and then the reaction will take place. So if you think of like baking a cake, you mix all the ingredients together, so we have our reactants, but they cannot bond chemically, they cannot alter without adding energy in the form of heat. That's what your oven does. That's cooking food. That's all we add energy to change the molecular structures. But other reactions release energy instead. When you pour baking soda and vinegar together, you don't have to do anything. They just start reacting. So they are releasing energy. Maybe you've made a tiny little rocket out of baking soda and vinegar. That's possible. You can make a little car. If you construct a little like a vessel or a tank or whatever you want to call it, and put baking soda and vinegar in it, if you give it just a little narrow escape route, whatever you want to call it, and attach it to like a pine wood car or whatever, it will propel the car forward. It's releasing its own energy. You didn't have to add any energy to it. If a reaction occurs spontaneously, it releases energy. The baking soda and vinegar reaction releases energy. But other reactions that require energy will not occur without input, and that's the cake baking example. So to stay alive, organisms need to perform reactions that require energy. That's why we have to eat food, and well, that's why plants photosynthesize. They borrow energy. We have to go out and get our energy. Life isn't possible without a constant input of raw materials and to break those materials apart and assemble them together. Now, a lot of that breaking apart and reassembling of materials just allows the organism to grow. I'm taller than I was 10 years ago, and so are all of you, I would hope. But another thing that happens is when the bonds are broken, that requires energy to do. Biology also requires reactions that release energy. So in order to grow, my body needs to take in products, and when the molecular bonds are broken in those other products, like our carbohydrates we eat, that releases energy, and it releases enough extra energy for me to grow. So what is the ultimate source of all this energy for virtually all life on the planet is the sun. Plants get their energy from the sun, and animals get our energy from nutrients. But the animals that don't eat any vegetation, they eat other animals, well, they rely still on the sun because their food needs its food. There actually are not really very many types of animals on the planet that only eat meat. Cats are one example. Cats are, there's a term for it, I can't remember what it is, but they are strictly carnivorous. They will not branch out. We say that dogs are carnivorous, but actually dogs can eat plant matter as well. Not every single reaction that releases energy will happen spontaneously. Now, there's a huge amount of spontaneous reactions that go on in our bodies. And your body is made of something like 35 trillion cells. So there's just an unimaginable quantity of chemical reactions that could just spontaneously happen all at once. It's quite a miracle that they don't. Now, life has had to evolve ways of controlling that, because if you think about, let's think about like a mad scientist's lab, right? Where he has all kinds of chemicals in drawers and cupboards, and they're all contained in glass containers. Well, if all those chemicals were just dumped in together, mixed, I mean, what would happen? Perhaps it would combust, it would create lots of smoke, it would change colors, it would do all these things. Now, our bodies, our cells are mostly water, and they're filled, your cells, they break down nutrients and things that we consume. So your cell is jam-packed with all of the components that react together to do things. But those those reactants somehow are kept from reacting together and forming products. Because otherwise, if that were somehow turned off, your body would just start doing chemical reactions like crazy, and your body would get so hot. What makes us warm-blooded is all these chemical reactions. Your body would get so hot that it would probably start to smolder, or it would cook your tissues on the inside. So luckily, that doesn't happen either. So our cells and the cells of indeed all animals, and we could extend this to other parts of life, because really all life works this way. We use activation energy. So there's like an initial spark that's required if you have gasoline, for example. When you light gasoline on fire, it will keep burning itself. It doesn't need any more input, but it can't combust unless you give it an initial spark, right? And life is kind of like that. So for a reaction that requires energy in order to occur, we can see that we have to input energy, but then we don't get a net return. So this gap between where we started and where we are here represents a loss. So in order for living things to grow and develop, for me to get taller, I have to consume energy, and I don't get any energy back. But there's an investment. If I get bigger, my body will be more efficient and faster at doing certain things. Whereas in a reaction that releases energy, yes, there is some activation energy, but there is more energy that comes out of it. So we can think about our digestive system, right? your digestive system is a series of muscles. They're called smooth muscles, right? Your esophagus, your stomach, and your intestines. Now, the only way muscles can contract is by they have to borrow energy, right? And they get that energy from food. But the breakdown of all that food, which takes some energy, ultimately gives us extra energy for exercise or to move around or for the body to repair itself. And that will be all down to your metabolism. If we think of an organism with a very slow metabolism, like an anaconda or something, they will eat quite a lot of food, but then they will remain completely inactive or largely inactive for very long periods of time because they're not quite as efficient. Mammals were warm-blooded, so we get a lot out of our food. The payoff though is that we have to eat way more calories than cold-blooded organisms do. There are some chemical reactions that living things require that take more energy than the organism can get. So to get around this, organisms make catalysts. So catalysts, a catalyst can be anything. It can work in any kind of chemical reaction, but it's just you add it to the reaction and it speeds it up. It gets it going faster. So you can think of it like if I wanted to make Kool-Aid, I could take a jug, pour in the sugar and the water. If I just leave it sit there, the sugar and the flavor will eventually dissolve and mix all the way through, but it would probably take hours and hours for that to happen. Or I could simply do some activation energy. I could stir it. Another thing is if you would put like rice in a bowl of water, eventually the rice would absorb the water and be cooked, right? It would be soft. But again, that would take a really, really long time. Instead, you add activation energy, which is heat. That's why we cook pasta and rice and things like that. So catalysts lower the activation energy. If you remember the graph, it had to climb so high before it could finally, the products or the reactants, could start interacting with each other. Well, an enzyme makes it so it doesn't have to go quite so high. In living things, enzymes are that, you've probably heard that word before, but maybe you have no idea what an enzyme is. An enzyme is a catalyst that a living thing produces. So in order for, for example, try to think, your circulatory system, your body transports oxygen with red blood cells. They're called erythrocytes. Well, red blood cells, your body has to recycle them every, I think it's around 120 days. So the body, you have a certain amount of red blood cells, but your body isn't necessarily always producing the same amount of red blood cells. If you were to, for example, travel or move to an area that's really high in altitude, well, what happens if you get higher up in altitude? The air is thinner, so there's less oxygen. So how does your body cope with that? Well, your body is stimulated. There's a specific hormone. It's called erythropoietin, sometimes just called EPO. And that hormone is it's like an enzyme, and it triggers the body to start hyper or overproducing red blood cells. Erythropoietin, that is actually, EPO was the substance that Lance Armstrong and all the bicyclists in the 90s were taking to cheat for professional bicycling, because it dumped extra red blood cells into their stream so they could carry more oxygen and their muscles were much more efficient. So here we go, this is what I was talking about. Without the enzyme, with the enzyme. So it allows the reaction to take place. So if we go back to the example with erythropoietin, that's the hormone that triggers your body to make more red blood cells. I'm not sure what an enzyme that could trigger that would be, but just theoretically, this is the way the body would normally produce red blood cells, or this is the rate the body would normally produce red blood cells. But if you cheat or if you move to that high altitude area, your body detects that, and so it lowers the activation energy. The other thing with enzymes, and this is what also prevents the body from just simply having all of its reactants react together all at once, is an enzyme can only work with one type of chemical reaction. So we think of it like a lock and key mechanism. The products of a reaction involving enzymes occur at a certain location on the enzyme, like a lock and key. The reactants of a chemical reaction that involve enzymes are called substrates. So we could, we had reactants and then products. If there's an enzyme involved, then we can also call those reactants substrates. It's just another word for the same thing. So here we see this would be, let me think. I can't remember off the top of my head, which is unfortunate, which of these is the enzyme and which of these is the substrate. So I believe, I want to say that this thing right here is the enzyme, and it's triggered by something connecting with it. So they actually sort of change their shape. Now, this enzyme cannot be activated unless the exact right type of material, whether it's a hormone or whatever, is present to activate it. So your body will not, for example, part of your brain called the hypothalamus is responsible for regulating your body temperature. So in a normal climate-controlled room, your hypothalamus should not be hyperactive, so your body temperature remains pretty stable. It will only be turned on, the enzymes that activate that will only be turned on if there's a trigger, like the temperature dropping. Now that can be thrown out of whack. One of the symptoms of menopause is an inability to control that, so hot flashes can result. Like I just said, there are certain conditions that have to be met. Another common thing that the body has to pretty much constantly be regulating, because it constantly fluctuates, is not just your body temperature, but the pH of your body as well. And then the body has certain ways of turning off enzymes when they're not needed.